Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're talking upgraded and updated deck lists. So yeah, a ton of awesome new cards came out in A4. Everybody is, busy playing all of the new cards and all of the new deck lists, but one thing that I always like to cover here on the channel when new seasons come on are, the old decks that have either changed a lot or not changed that much. I like to kind of showcase an updated and an upgraded version of all of these decks, and then talk about, sort of how I feel about them going into sort of a new season. So that's what this video is going to be all about. I believe we've gotten 8 or 9 old deck lists here that have been updated or changed with new cards in A4. And comment down below if there's anything we missed in this video. It's probably just because it isn't seeing really any play right now, or nothing changed with the deck. And that's, I guess just how that goes. So let's get right into it, guys. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe. So the first deck that we're going to talk about here is going to be Flareon and Leafeon, which has actually continued to be one of the most popular decks, the most played decks in this new season. And to be fair, not much has really changed with this deck list. What you will notice is that we are just playing the new Find a Friend Eevee as opposed to the, the Draw a Card Eevee. And that's actually something that's probably going to be the case for a number of different decks in this video. Probably the only significant change to a lot of these sort of Sylveon or Evolution decks is going to be the inclusion of this new Eevee card, which I guess we'll just kind of get it out of the way and talk about it right now. I do think that Find a Friend Eevee is exclusively better in almost every scenario. The only reason we would want to draw a card instead of just drawing a specific card is if we don't need that specific card in which we would draw. When we're playing Eevee, we almost always want the Evolution. That's the whole point, right? And we've seen Find a Friend cards before. These are always really strong cards. They basically thin out their deck. That's like targeted search, which is in general really strong. If you're playing basically Sylveon, you're always going to want to play the Find a Friend Eevee, because that's just going to increase your odds of you finding a Sylveon EX and being able to evolve into it next turn to draw 2 more cards. So theoretically speaking, the only real change to this deck list is going to be the Find a Friend Eevee. However, that's probably going to be the case for a number of different decks. So I'm just going to go ahead and talk about, where I feel like these decks are positioned in the format and like how they sort of work, and if they are exclusively better or worse than they were before. Flareon and Leafeon, I think actually is in a really well positioned spot right now in the metagame. There's a lot of stuff early on that, to be fair, really isn't that good. When new formats come out, people are testing the new decks. They're trying out the new cards. They're kind of figuring things out. They're still optimizing. So basically, a lot of the old, most consistent decks of the previous seasons, which have already been figured out, are always at a bit of an advantage, because they've already had some time for people to play them, get familiar with them, construct a deck that is, in theory, kind of well-positioned or well-structured. And the new decks aren't always like that, So I do think that Flareon Leafeon is very, very consistent, but more than just its consistency, I think it actually does have a really decent spot from a positioning perspective when you just look at the other cards and the other decks that are seeing a lot of play in the format. The 2 most common decks right now, actually this weekend, which, again, you guys should stay tuned because Meta Monday will be coming tomorrow. The 2 most popular decks in the meta right now, or early in the season, were actually Giratina Darkrai, and then, of course, Buzzwole. And Leafeon and Flareon is a deck that actually does pretty well against both of those decks. Of course, Leafeon hitting for weakness on things like Darkrai EX, and then Flareon is able to deal super effective damage on a Buzzwole and KO it if it doesn't have a Leaf Cape. And those are really valuable sort of pieces there. We can also extend to 1-hit KO really anything with Flareon with Red and Eevee Bag. We can 1-hit KO a Giratina EX. Traditionally speaking, this has been sort of a deck that does fairly well against those 2 matchups. Oricorio, we do have Leafeon, but, Turbo Sylvally right now is really, really fast-paced. And the other deck list that's sort of arisen, this format being Espeon and Sylveon, I think does have maybe the edge over this deck list in overall consistency, but, it really just kind of comes down probably to who goes second or who draws the correct cards. But in theory, I think this deck is actually really well positioned right now. It's very consistent, and I think a lot of the new decks that people are playing just aren't necessarily very strong against this deck list here, which is definitely interesting to note. So anyway, big shout out to Flareon Leafeon. It is definitely something to keep your eye on. It's definitely worth playing. This isn't a deck list that I don't think we've talked about so far since the new season started, but I do think it's still very high quality, so I have to recommend that you go ahead and try and play it, if, of course, this is a deck that you like to play. Next up, let's talk about Garchomp, which does have, I guess, a couple of new inclusion cards that I saw some person running. I don't know their name, but some player here in a recent online tournament did fairly well playing Garchomp. And again, this is basically the same list as it was previously, but as we see here, we're playing that Find a Friend Eevee instead of the Draw Card Eevee. And then this player here has elected to throw in one copy of Hiker, which I actually kind of like. Hiker, again, I still believe is a very underrated card. I think that if fighting type archetypes ever become really common in the future, I think that Hiker is just going to be a pretty valuable card here. On the off turns where we don't have Professor's Research, Hiker is going to provide a lot of consistency. One thing to note, though, is that there are a lot of cards that your opponent can play that shuffles your deck, and that's certainly something that's going to disrupt Hiker's ability. But yeah, I think that Garchomp and Sylveon is actually pretty decent right now. There's a lot of Oricorio. There's a lot of baby Pokemon that Gible can KO somewhat effectively if, of course, we're playing Giovanni. This list is not. But, Garchomp is a 1 energy attack cost, right, doing 50 damage, and that's going to be really nice. There's a lot of Crobats running around. There's a lot of Eevees in the active spots. Garchomp, right, if you're going first, you can Rare Candy Evolve and then KO that active, which is going to be pretty cool. And then, of course, Cranidos also does 50 damage and is also a fighting type Pokemon, so it's going to get the KOs in those same scenarios. We're hitting for weakness on Crobat. That's a big deal for sure, but Garchomp with Lily, it's got a ton of HP. It's really, really nice. This deck list doesn't play Cyrus, and sometimes when you're playing Garchomp and you're not playing Cyrus, it doesn't feel that great. I think Garchomp is totally fine in the metagame right now. I think that it has been a little bit overshadowed by the inclusion of Donphan. I had somebody ask in the comment section, like, why are everyone playing Donphan when, like, Garchomp exists? Isn't Garchomp kind of just better? I mean, Donphan also being a 1 energy, 50 damage attack Pokemon is kind of similar. Like, to be fair, Donphan is almost identical to Garchomp in the sense that they both deal 50 damage for 1 energy, and then Donphan does 110 for 3. Garchomp does 100 for 3. The only difference here is that if we're playing Garchomp, we have 10 more HP than Donphan. It's really not that big of a difference. Donphan has 160. But Garchomp here, the linear attack is able to attack a bench Pokemon, right? So that is an alternate win condition. Overall, I actually feel like Donphan has kind of just replaced Garchomp because they are so similar. And because it's a stage 1 Pokemon, people feel a little bit more comfortable just playing Donphan in this meta. Yeah, I think that Garchomp is still fairly fine. This is sort of an updated version of it. I don't know how many people are going to choose to play Garchomp right now, but it is, an old deck that is still in the metagame. And it's really interesting because I honestly do feel like in this season right now, in this new meta, we have like so many decks, like there's so many decks that are like meta viable decks. There's probably more than there ever has been in Pokemon Pocket. And I think that we're probably going to see that reflected in the data and in the results of tomorrow or today's tournament, which we're going to cover in Meta Monday tomorrow. This is probably going to end up being one of the most spread out, metas of all time. There's a really interesting sort of anomaly or an effect that's happening in Pokemon Pocket now. Because we have so many cards in the game and so many sets. When new cards are released, like a lot of people feel like they're underwhelming, but the reason they kind of feel that way is because there's so many good decks already in the format that no matter how strong a card is when they release it, there's going to be something that's already seeing play that's going to be strong against that deck, right? So I think we're sort of, gone are the times of these decks kind of sort of coming into Pokemon Pocket and just being by far better than everything else in the game. There's just too many options and there's too many different meta decks and strong decks in the game of Pokemon Pocket right now that anything new that comes to the game has to contend with a wide variety of really, really strong decks, which are already, tried, tested, and proven. So I think A4 has a lot of really strong inclusions. However, I also feel like any good card that came out in A4, there's counterplay to it. So it's just sort of adds to this really large sort of mixed bag of really good deck lists. Some are going to rise to the top for sure, but, overall, I think this will probably end up being the most balanced meta we've ever had. Anyway, here's Garchomp. Hasn't changed that much, but for the Garchomp players, this would be an updated Garchomp deck. Next up is going to be Solgaleo. So I know some people have been asking about Solgaleo. I think it's actually pretty interesting. If you take a look again at the meta report for today's or this weekend's tournament, like I said, the 2 most common decks are Giratina, Darkrai, and Buzzwole. Those are kind of the 2 most consistent decks that we have in Pokemon Pocket right now. And Solgaleo theoretically actually has a winning matchup against both of those decks, which is really interesting. So maybe there is actually a pretty decent space for Solgaleo in the format. You could play the new, the tool card, the Steel Apron. You could play that card in place of Leftovers. That would, of course, remove the ability to get status conditioned on your Solgaleo, which is pretty cool. But I don't think that it's actually better than Leftovers. I think Leftover actually just provides more value. Since it procs after your turn, Solgaleo deals 10 damage to itself after you attack. So Leftovers kind of wipes that damage. I think that Leftovers is basically built for Solgaleo. And I think that it's probably the correct option in this deck list still. Steel Apron is cool, but again, I don't think that we're going to struggle against Crobat anyway. So it's not really something that I would sort of recommend over Leftovers. I think Leftovers is kind of strictly better. And then, yes, of course, the Find a Friend Eevee, just better than the Draw Card Eevee in almost every sense. I mean, it's just the only time where you wouldn't need the Find a Friend Eevee more than the Draw Card Eevee is if somehow every Pokemon is already in your hand or on the board. That doesn't really happen. Eevee is a Pokemon that we're using early in the game, so Find a Friend, strictly better. More likely, we're just going to draw into Sylveon EX. I like Solgaleo. I really do. However, one thing to note is that Crobat for 1 energy is going to KO Eevee and Cosmog. So no matter what's in our active spot, if we don't get set up before our opponent's Crobat does, we're going to kind of get outpaced a little bit. That is certainly, a little bit scary. Espeon is also something that could be kind of difficult to deal with just because Solgaleo does 120, but Espeon heals for, upwards of like 60 to 80 damage every turn, basically, with Eevee Cape, Eevee Bag, and then they have Giant Capes, and then, of course, the Espeon healing. So, Pokemon like this, like Solgaleo is still really strong, but there are going to be some matchups in the format right now that are, a little bit iffy for Solgaleo. But again, good against Buzzwole traditionally, good against Giratina Darkrai traditionally. So I think that Solgaleo actually has an opportunity to kind of rise back up. Not seeing a ton of play. This is sort of by far the least amount of play that Solgaleo EX has seen so far. Maybe it's going to rise up as time goes on, but this is really all I would change about the deck list. And again, I think that it's actually going to be it would have been a decent meta call this weekend. I don't know how many people played it. Really not that many. And a lot less people are playing Charizard as well, which is another interesting note. One of the things that Solgaleo kind of struggled with. I like Solgaleo, and I think, again, it's only been increased. All of these Sylveon decks have been buffed to some degree just by the inclusion of this new Find a Friend Eevee. But to be fair, I don't think Steel Apron is better than Leftovers, and I don't really know if there's too much else that I would really change about this deck. There's not that much space. Magirda is still a decent option into Oricorio, which is pretty cool. So I think that this deck list, as it's constructed, is totally fine. 1 Guzma, 1 Lily, 1 Red, 1 Sabrina. There were lists last formats playing 2 Sabrina. Maybe that is still something that you could, I guess play. Where there's quite a bit of Oricorio now. There might be more Oricorio in this format than there ever has been, which is kind of funny. Maybe that falls off. Maybe it kind of goes up as time goes on. We really don't know. Oricorio is certainly something that you have to prepare for because there's so much of it, at least in tournaments. In ranked battles, I still actually have seen a lot of Oricorio, mostly just played with Sylvally. I think that the new Lightning type turbo package is absolutely crazy. We'll take a look at that later in this video in more depth. But anyway, Solgaleo EX updated here. Hasn't been changed that much, but again, I do think that it has the potential to be still a really, really decent deck in this metagame right now. Next up is going to be Tapu Koko Arceus. So, Tapu Koko Arceus was one of my favorite archetypes of the previous formats. I actually think now, with Energy Switch, Tapu Koko and Arceus has as good of a combination as we've ever had, realistically. And I think that this has the potential to end up being one of the best decks of the format. I don't think it will ever see more play than Sylvally. And I'm going to say that right now. People just are really high on Sylvally. And of course, Sylvally's a very, very strong Pokemon. It's just one of the most consistent aggressive Pokemon in the entire game. And again, you could just swap out the Tapu Koko and Arceus. You could swap out the electrical cords for Sylvally and and type Null, and then of course, what is it? Gladion, right? And then the deck, is a little bit stronger in some ways. So, I think a lot of people are just going to play Sylvally, and we will take a look at Sylvally decks here in a little bit. But yeah, no, Tapu Koko Arceus is still really strong. What's really cool about this deck list now with Elemental Switch and Electrical Cord is that we are so consistently able to get those 3 energies onto Arceus and Tapu Koko, right? Zeraora is going to generate that energy. We can attach to Tapu Koko, attack, or we can just sort of move that energy immediately if we're going second, or we can even attack with Arceus on turn 2 pretty consistently. So this deck list has a lot of upside to it. I think it's actually better than it ever has been before. And of course, we are playing Oricorio, so, we're going to win games a lot of ways just like that. And I think, honestly, the number one sort of archetypes that have benefited the most from Elemental Switch are going to be these sort of turbo electric type decks. You could also play this deck list with Pichu. We'll take a look at some of the baby decks as well, which also have updated this particular strategy. But since they gave us Elemental Switch in the set with Pichu and Magby, you're kind of either playing like Zeraora and Elemental Switch, or you're playing the Pichu Magby combo, and you're kind of going with baby. So it's interesting. I think a lot of people still prefer to play Zeraora just because like it's sort of effectively the same thing, but it doesn't have to be in the active spot. It's not a significant downside if it is in the active spot, especially with Electrical Cord. If you're playing it in the deck list, it's a kind of an aggressive attacking option. So it's definitely sort of an interesting catch-22 here. We are playing 1 Silver, and this is definitely going to be an important thing to note. And I think this is the first time we're really seeing Silver in an updated deck list. I think that Silver is broken right now. What we used to see before was a lot of people just sort of throwing Mars in their deck, which I think is still a really, really strong card. But Silver is incredibly strong, especially early on. What we see here is this red card, Silver combination. You guys might have seen some sort of clips on social media or whatever. Like, the early game combo of red card into Silver is unreal. We can play supporters on our first turn. So basically, if you're going first, what we can do is play red card, drop our opponent into 3 cards in their hand, and then play Silver and then discard, or I guess remove and shuffle back into the deck a supporter card if it is in their hand. Basically effectively making your opponent start the game with only 2 cards in their hand, which is hilarious, especially if they lead off with only 1 basic Pokemon. It's a really, really disruptive early game strategy, and in general, Silver is really decent in the late game, especially since things like Sabrina, Cyrus, Giovanni Red are win conditions. Silver's a really sort of anti-win condition card, where late in the game, if you know next turn, if your opponent has a Cyrus, you lose, you can play that Silver, and if they do have that Cyrus already in their hand, you can put it back into their deck, and then force them to play off the top deck. It's kind of a more consistent way to guarantee, or more effectively guarantee, that your opponent doesn't have that win condition than playing something like a Mars and dropping them just to 1 card in hand. It's similar, like you could play Silver and Mars, and they could both, you know, sort of do similar things, but the thing with Silver is it provides more value in the early game, whereas Mars kind of doesn't, right? In the early game, it's just a red card. So I think we're kind of seeing a little bit more of this sort of Silver red card stuff. I think that hand disruption in general is really, really strong. Red card and Silver is hand disruption, but red card a little bit more of an early game card, but Silver useful in the early and late game, which is definitely a massive upside to Silver. But anyway, yeah, Tapu Koko Arceus, it's still really, really good. I don't think it will ever see more play than Sylvally. I think that it's effectively very similar. The upside to Tapu Koko Arceus, of course, is that they have more HP than Sylvally, and they hit for more damage. At least Arceus does, right? So that's kind of the difference. Tapu Koko in general is a really strong leadoff going second. So that's, you know, kind of the upside. Sylvally going second's also strong, but Tapu Koko theoretically should win that head-to-head matchup into Sylvally. So that is sort of the upside, right, when you're playing Tapu Koko. But anyway, here it is. Here's an updated sort of Arceus Tapu Koko deck. It's going to float around a little bit, but I still think these lightning archetypes, these turbo lightning decks, are so good. Elemental Switch really has changed the game. This might end up being the most influential card, the most played card in the future to come out of A4 is Elemental Switch. It's just an absolutely broken card. All right, guys, next up, yes, okay, listen, 69% of you guys that have been watching my videos over the last few days are not subscribed. We're going to be doing this plug a little bit more often. You guys have been doing a really good job hitting that subscribe button, and I really do appreciate it. We just hit 30,000 subscribers, and again, the support is incredible, but, you know, go ahead and just check. Look down below. If you're not subscribed, just consider hitting that subscribe button. It supports me and supports the channel. I would really, really appreciate it. We got content coming all of the time here, and hopefully you guys find it useful. You don't want to miss out on these videos, so go ahead, hit that subscribe button. All right, next up is Charizard. So again, you know, the thing with Charizard, similar to a lot of these sort of Sylveon rare candy decks, is that not much has changed. You know, Charizard is Charizard, yes, but we do get buffed by the new Find a Friend Eevee. And yes, this is just a direct buff to Charizard. And this is going to be kind of the same stuff that we're seeing right now, but this is going to be playing red. Now, last season, I talked about playing Guzma in Charizard. Every single time we talked about it, I said, play Guzma. You should play Guzma. It's the correct card. I actually think that red might be the more correct option than Guzma right now, at least with Crobat seeing a lot of play. Crobat Giant Cape puts them at 190 HP. But the thing is that Guzma, if we Guzma the Giant Cape off of Crobat, we're still not KOing. So I think that red is actually a little bit better. In general, I think that, you know, with more times with red, effectively right now, we're taking a KO than with Guzma. There's just enough Pokemon where I would rather have red than that. It's still going to be a better option than Guzma against Solgaleo. It's better against Crobat, in my opinion. All of these sort of evolution decks with Giant Cape go to 160, so we're still getting a KO on them. Giratina EX, Darkrai EX with Giant Cape, we're still taking a KO on them. So red, in my mind, would be better than Guzma right now. Theoretically speaking, for discarding Giant Capes and hitting those breakpoints, Guzma is better, but there's a few Pokemon that we are able to extend in KO even without Giant Cape. So that's kind of where red comes in. But anyway, Charizard, same old Charizard now with the Find a Friend Eevee. You know, Charizard is also, again, really, really interesting because not many people are playing it this weekend. We'll talk about it more tomorrow in Meta Monday. But again, a lot of Giratina Darkrai and a lot of Buzzwole. Charizard is a deck that does really well against those two decks, so it's interesting. I think that, you know, Crobat has really taken over in terms of the popular sort of rare candy Sylveon deck right now. A lot of people are playing Crobat because it's new and it's aggressive, but it doesn't do as well against a lot of these sort of tempo ramp decks like Giratina Darkrai, like the evolution decks, and like, of course, Buzzwole, but Charizard does really well against all of those. So that's the upside to playing Charizard, is that I think it's actually a very, very effective and strategic meta call towards a lot of the most popular and just consistent decks in the entire game, which of course are these sort of tempo decks that are playing low Pokemon count, that Charizard is able to one-hit KO pretty easily. So I honestly think that Charizard might end up still being one of the better options right now. Maybe not for a week or two until things settle down. And again, I really wouldn't change much about Charizard. Again, I would really just play Eevee. You could swap out Mars here for, what is it, like Silver? So we could play Silver instead of Mars and Charizard, but we don't have room to play red card. So we don't have the red card Silver combo. We can't make that happen. So I think one copy Mars is still probably better. The reason for that, of course, is just once your first Charizard goes down, or if they KO with Sylveon, it's really nice to just go ahead and then play Mars and then drop them down to one card in hand. By that time, you're probably going to have Mars in your hand, so it's just probably a better option here for these this particular deck, where mostly all of our deck is these sort of EX Pokemon, and your opponent's going to have to go through either a Sylveon and a Charizard or two Charizards, and Mars is going to make it a lot more difficult to do that. So I think Mars is correct here. Again, the only change is the Find a Friend Eevee. Charizard, just like Solgaleo, I think has a really good chance to be really well positioned in this metagame, so it's not something to sleep on whatsoever. But someone's probably going to comment about Squirt Bottle. So let's talk about Squirt Bottle. Yes, they did give us an item card that basically is a direct counter to Charizard, right? So if Charizard ever completely took over the format again, or if Flareon takes over the format, we have Squirt Bottle, which is just going to basically entirely counterplay those decks, probably just provide an auto win against them. But spoiler, nobody's playing Squirt Bottle, right? So I guess the fear of it maybe stopped people from playing Charizard. But yeah, basically 99.9% of people are not playing Squirt Bottle in their deck. So it's not really something to worry about. I know some people are going to comment that, but no one's playing it. So keep that in mind. I think Charizard is still a really strong option. Next up, we've gotten Sylveon and Giratina and Greninja. So kind of the top deck of the previous format, although I would say Charizard was the best deck last format. But anyway, the most played deck of last season is going to be, of course, Greninja, Sylveon, and Giratina. Now, what's the difference now with this deck list? Well, the big upside to playing this deck is that we have actually quite a bit of room for some hand disruption, right? We're not playing Giant Cape in this list. We're only playing one copy of Cyrus, but we are playing two copies of Silver, one red card, one Mars. So, there's a couple of different variations, right? We have some space here. We don't have to play Sabrina. We don't have to play Giant Cape. We don't have to play any of that stuff, really. I will say that hand disruption is just going to win you so many games right now. So this is sort of an updated version. I do think that Find a Friend, of course, Eevee is a big buff to this deck list. In general, it can find Giratina, it can find Sylveon, it can find Greninja. All really strong stuff here. This deck is playing a lot of hand disruption. I would maybe cut the Mars here to play at least one Giant Cape, or of course, you could play a second Cyrus. That's another decent option for sure. So there's a lot of sort of variations here. Maybe just sort of one red card, one silver. We cut the Mars, we play Giant Cape. Maybe we play a Sabrina or a second Cyrus, something like that. You never really know. You could even play a Pokemon Communications in this deck, and that also could be pretty strong, realistically. But yeah, I think that the combo of red and silver, or no, red card and silver works really well in this deck list, and it's buffed by Friend to Friend Eevee. Let's talk about this deck's matchups into the metagame right now. Traditionally, this deck list actually did struggle against Giratina Darkrai, which again is very common in the format right now, so it's kind of sketchy. It's a little bit of a sketchy sort of scenario. The one downside to the inconsistency of this deck is, of course, we're playing dual energies most of the time. And of course, by the way, energy types will be down in the timestamps below, but this deck normally plays water and psychic energies, which inherently gives it a bit of inconsistency, which is really not something that we see often in the format. And I do think that this season, it's actually more of a drawback than it was last season. There's a lot of Sylvally or Oricorio. There's a lot of aggression. One thing I will say is that Greninja plus Giratina hitting for 150 isn't what it used to be. A lot of decks are actually able to live that 150 damage combo, which means that we're not oftentimes one-hit KOing Pokemon. Espeon is a deck that's really on the rise right now, and Espeon is very, very consistent, very fast-paced. In fact, I would say that Espeon going second is almost an auto-win against this deck list, just because it's inherently not that consistent, and it's not as it's more of a high-roll deck than it kind of felt last format, kind of for sure. So that's kind of how I feel about it, like in a format with a lot of Giratina Darkrai, with sort of Crobat EX and a lot of these rare candy decks floating around. Turbo Sylvally is super fast-paced and aggressive. The new Espeon deck, of course, we have Flareon and Leafeon. I actually don't feel as strongly about Greninja Sylveon as I do a lot of the other old decks in the format. And that's interesting. It's an interesting thing for me to think about and to really say here. I never really expected to feel that way, but yeah, I really don't know if I would strongly recommend playing this archetype above some of the other old archetypes, which I think are still really good in the format. We'll see how it performs this weekend. Tomorrow would Meta Monday, but yeah, it's honestly not something that I feel super good about in terms of its position against a lot of the decks that are seeing play, at least early on this season. All right, next up, we do have Sylvally, Oricorio, and Zeraora. I think we've talked about this deck probably already a couple of times. This deck maybe has, I guess, just been buffed more than any other deck in the game. It hasn't changed a whole lot, you know, but we do have Elemental Switch, and then we can throw in Silver for this deck list. This deck here is playing Pokemon Center Lady with 1 Silver and 1 Elemental Switch. Again, we're going to showcase a baby version of this sort of archetype with Sylvally after this, but again, Elemental Switch does make this sort of turn 2 Sylvally combo a little bit more consistent, but honestly, it's just Turbo Sylvally, and I think that Silver is such a good card in Sylvally. Like, they actually buffed it even more for whatever the reason, right? Most Sylvally decks are playing Lightning Energy, so Elemental Switch is just a non-supporter version of it that we can play, you know, Cyrus or Gladion or Giovanni or Research in the same turn that we play Elemental Switch, and you might feel like, okay, but wouldn't we want to play Dawn just because it's a supporter, so it satisfies the condition for Brave Buddies? I don't actually think so. I think that all of the supporters we have in the deck, we've got enough of them already, and they're all kind of better to play on that turn. So I know we're playing 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 1 Silver. I would honestly just cut this Pokemon Center Lady and play 2 Elemental Switch, and I would just run 2 Research, 2 Geo, 2 Gladion, a Cyrus, and a Silver, and that's more than enough supporters in my mind for this deck to be hyper consistent. The whole idea is that we are able to attack with Brave Buddies on our second turn if we're going first with Sylvally. Going first was always a big downside for Sylvally, but now with baby Pokemon with Elemental Switch, I just think it's less of a downside, and Silver is just a really like an awesome supporter card that we can play in Sylvally deck. So I actually think Turbo Sylvally has been buffed maybe more than any other deck in the meta right now, which is kind of crazy because it was already one of the top decks for sure. And of course, Oricorio is always going to be really strong in the early format. So yeah, here's an updated version of the deck list. There's another sort of flavor though that I do want to showcase right here, which is going to be Turbo Sylvally with Oricorio, but we're actually playing Magby, and this is an interesting one because, of course, we could just play Pichu in the deck. It really doesn't matter what this baby Pokemon is. Some people are going to ask, why are we playing Magby instead of Pichu? It literally doesn't matter because we're playing Lightning Energies as the deck energy, as the single energy for our deck, so it doesn't matter. Like, this person just threw in a Magby because they thought it would be funny probably, but if you play Pichu in this deck, it literally does effectively the same thing. There's never a time where we're not going to be able to attack with Oricorio and Sylvally because we're playing Lightning Energies in the deck list. But this is the other version. I didn't want to confuse you guys with the Magby here. This can be Pichu. I wanted to say that right off the bat. So the difference here, right, is that we're not playing Energy Switch and we're not playing Zeraora. We're just playing a baby Pokemon, which is going to be a really, really strong leadoff to, of course, attach to type Null on our first turn. Turn 2, we evolve into Sylvally, manually attach, and then boom, turn 2 going first, 100 damage. Really strong. So there's 2 different sides of the coin here. Again, you could play baby Pokemon with Zeraora, and I think that could be a really funny deck, but you'd probably want to cut the Oricorios if that was the case. And I don't think right now the extra fast-paced and consistency is like worth not playing Oricorio, if that makes any sense whatsoever. You could play 1 copy of Oricorio, right? So, you know, there's a couple of different things that could happen, you know, and different sort of things that we can, you know, I guess sort of mix and match with this particular archetype. But like I was saying, Sylvally now has multiple cards and multiple strategies that all go well together, and it's kind of scary. I'm going to be honest with you. This deck doesn't play Silver, but I do think Silver is really good in Sylvally. I would kind of recommend playing it. Pokemon Center Lady is actually interesting, but I think most people are playing 1 copy of Pokemon Center Lady in Oricorio for probably all of those matchups where Oricorio is just going to kind of win the game as long as we have some sort of healing. That's probably the idea of playing Pokemon Center Lady in Oricorio, which is probably correct if we're being completely honest here. So yeah. Not much else I can say about Sylvally. It's still one of the best decks in the entire game, still one of the most played decks in the entire game, and I think it's probably the one card that just got buffed more than anything else, with, of course, the baby Pokemon working perfectly with it. Honestly, it's like one of the best Pokemon to pair with the baby Pokemon, and then, of course, we have, you know, Elemental Switch if we are still playing the Zeraora package. So yeah, there you go. Sylvally next up. And lastly, let's just talk about Giratina Darkrai. I did talk about it in my best decks for ranked mode video. So again, there's going to be some redundancy in today's video, but how are we going to update Giratina Darkrai? Well, we don't really need to. It's basically the same deck. We could slot in a silver here instead of Mars like this player's doing. I think that 2 Rocky Helmet and 1 Giant Cape is interesting. There's still enough Oricorio where we are a bit pressured to play the Rocky Helmets and of course Darkrai to kind of get over Oricorio. That's always been the strategy and the idea with Giratina and Darkrai. And I think that traditionally, Darkrai plus Rocky Helmet plus the healing cards allows you to basically just outpace Oricorio. And that's a really interesting thought process. And again, I still think a lot of the Oricorio decks right now are not playing a lot of healing cards, which kind of opens up the pathways here for Giratina and Darkrai to still be able to win that matchup, which is why people are still playing Giratina Darkrai this way. If, of course, we kind of bypass the need to counter Oricorio, or if Oricorio plays some actual healing, or they play Guzma, I honestly kind of feel like we can build Giratina Darkrai to be completely degenerate, right? So if Oricorio wasn't in the format right now, we wouldn't have to play the Rocky Helmets, we wouldn't have to play the Pokemon Center Lady or the Potions as much, and we could probably honestly just play like double red card, double silver, and it would be absolutely hilarious. It would be probably one of the funniest things that we could possibly do in the game, and I just think that it's really, really funny. So anyway, that's sort of my 2 cents about Giratina Darkrai right now. Spoiler, it is the most played deck of this first Ursa Days tournament this weekend, and there's honestly no surprise there. Like I said, I think there's so much new cards and new decks that the meta shares is actually massively spread out, and I think that basically that means that there's not one deck or one strategy that came out of A4 that a lot of people are playing. Some people are playing Espeon, some people are playing Crobat, some people are playing Lugia and Ho-Oh, some people are playing like updated sort of lightning decks and things like that. So it's very spread out, which is honestly good for the metagame, but it's good for Giratina and Darkrai because not one specific counter to Giratina Darkrai has been sort of, has emerged, I guess, in the format. Although I would say probably the best counterplay to Giratina Darkrai would be things like Lugia, but that's beside the point regardless. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say. So, this was definitely more of a video talking about sort of the old decks, less so about them being, all of these decks have been upgraded technically, right? Even like the Sylvally decks just playing EV upgrades the deck lists, but they're all still relevant, and that's the one thing that I really wanted to cover in this video is that even some of the old decks that haven't changed that much have been upgraded pretty significantly and are still really strong options. So I wanted to kind of give an update as to sort of what old decks are still quality and if they're good and if they're worth playing still right now for whatever the reason. Giratina Darkrai probably the #1 example of that. So we had to talk about it in today's video. But anyway, guys, let's wrap it up here. This is it's Sunday as I record this, which again, we're sort of just buffering right now. We're waiting for the results to wrap up for this first Ursa Days tournament, which I am super, super excited about. Honestly, I cannot wait. Like, I've never been more excited for a Meta Monday than I have been for tomorrow, and I think it's going to be super interesting, and we're going to go in. That's probably going to be a very long video. I'm probably going to just absolutely dive into the data and the results, and it's going to be a big one. It's going to be a lot of fun, and of course, the tier list on Tuesday will be equally as fun for us to dive into. So anyway, guys, there we go. Updated and upgraded decks. Comment down below what you guys think here. How are you upgrading and updating your old deck lists? I would love to hear down below if there's anything that we didn't cover in this video. Comment down below and then share your opinions on it. I really appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, we'll see you guys later. Bye.